Welcome to today's Australia at Home. My name's Marcus Strom. I'm the president of MIA Media, Australia's Journalists Union. Thanks for joining us today. First of all, before we get started, I'd just like to acknowledge that we are all on Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander land or Native American land if we're in the United States. And I like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people, their elders past, present and emerging. So today it's pretty relaxed. If you haven't been to one of these before, this is meant to be, I'm in my living room. I'm sure most of you are as well. This is meant to be a relaxed and inclusive kind of session. If you haven't been to one of these before, turn your screen to gallery mode. That's in the top right-hand corner of your Zoom frame. Turn your cameras on. That's why we can see each other. Makes it a much more personal experience, I think. And if you do get a chance to speak today, and hopefully we will get to you, introduce yourself, put your questions for the panelists in the chat area, and hopefully we'll be able to get to you. We are recording this video, so do keep it all nice if you can. And I will just go to introduce you to our panelists first. We have Anne Davies. Anne Davies is a Gold Walkley winning investigative journalist, a former colleague of mine at the Herald. She joined Guardian Australia in 2017. She reports on a broad range of issues across business, politics, urban planning, environmental investigations, and the changing nature of work. We also have with us Professor Peter Greste, who's UNESCO Chair in Journalism and Communication at University of Queensland. He previously worked for the 10 Network, Reuters, BBC, before moving to Al Jazeera. And as many of you will know, while reporting in Egypt, he was arrested, tried and convicted on trumped-up charges, and he was imprisoned for 400 days. He is also the director of the Alliance for Journalist Freedom. And joining us from Washington, DC is Courtney Radsch, who's the Advocacy Director of the Committee to Protect Journalists and the author of Cyber Activism and Citizen Journalism in Egypt. And she's a journalist, researcher, free expression advocate, and Courtney writes and speaks frequently about the intersection of media, technology, and human rights. So please welcome them all. What we'll do today is we'll really break it up into three themes. First theme I'll turn to Anne is what we've experienced in Australia at the moment. We're celebrating the release of MIA's Press Freedom Report, which just came out this week, which you can download at pressfreedom.org.au. We've also done a survey. 98% of people who responded to that survey said that press freedom in Australia got worse in the last 12 months, 98%. That's on top of 90.9% the following year who said it got worse. We've also slipped down the ranks of press freedom from 21 to 26, and we've had the infamous raids on the ABC and Annika Smethurst's house this year. Globally, the IFJ says 49 people, journalists and media workers, were killed last year. And MIA itself, we have 2 members in overseas jails for publishing information that governments don't want to be seen. That's Yang Hong Jen in China and Julian Assange, who's in jail in Britain at the moment. So I'll turn to Anne, because often these big ticket issues do loom large, but it's often the small day-to-day issues that really affect how journalists do their work. How does this affect your work, Anne?
Well, I think underlying it is a serious breakdown in the understanding or convention that we had that journalists served a useful role as a check and balance on power and the powerful. And now that we've lost that, I think there is a completely different attitude towards journalists from the powerful, like, you know, Donald Trump regularly berates journalists. Peter Dutton has had some pretty cruel things to say about our profession. And, you know, generally I think there's this sort of fear that's growing that that we don't have a common understanding of what we're doing. So obviously the raids were a really big thing for working journalists. Annika Smethurst had a small win in that they said the raids were unlawful, but we still don't know what's going to happen with the material that was gathered in those raids. I've just found that, you know, it's sort of contacting sources is really tricky these days, especially when you want to reach out for the first time. Say you want to try and contact a bureaucrat, you'd think, how do I do this without leaving an electronic trail that could ruin their careers, even if they decide not to talk to you? So, day to day, it's quite tricky. The other huge problem we have is defamation law. So Matt Collins, who is the Victorian Bar President, recently said that Australia was the defamation capital of the world. He said we'd taken English common law and then made it much worse. And that's certainly my lived experience. I would say defamation is the single biggest problem that I have day to day as an investigative journalist. That you go through this incredible rigmarole with the lawyers, trying to find a form of words that doesn't give rise to an imputation. So defamation for me is probably the biggest problem. But I'd also say, the freedom of information laws, which are meant to be there to help us expose what's happening in government, it's meant to be, the government is meant to subscribe to the idea that the information is public information. In fact, their attitude is completely different these days. You get back FOIs that are just absolutely hopeless. They're clearly not giving you what you asked for. They take the narrowest reading possible. And then when you appeal to the Freedom of Information Commissioner, the problem is she is so overworked that we're waiting 12 months for a case officer to be appointed, and then it can take 18 months for a decision. So practically, it's pretty much a useless route these days for getting government information.
So it sounds more like a freedom from information process.
It's frustrating.
And Peter, do you think that there has been an increase in secrecy from the government, that governments tend to avoid transparency at all costs, even over petty things? And this is seen in these different regimes, whether it's defamation or FOI.
Yeah, look, overall we're seeing that. And I just want to also reinforce what Anne's been saying. At the University of Queensland, we've been, doing some research into the impact at a larger scale of the kind of legislation that we've been talking about, and Anne has spoken of the impact of the raids on the relationship with sources. One of the difficulties that we're having at the moment is describing to Australians what this really means, because it doesn't feel as though our media is restricted unduly. You open up the papers and there's all sorts of stories that criticise the government. And so what we're trying to do is really describe a negative, to describe the stories, or understand the numbers of stories that aren't being told as a result of this. And what Anne has just described, in which the situation in which sources are increasingly reluctant to come forward, or in fact are shutting down communications altogether, is something that's reflected right across the country in journalists everywhere. We're also seeing at all levels of government a growing culture of secrecy, a kind of urge to control the message, to limit access that journalists have to anyone other than official spokespeople. And that's not the way open government is supposed to operate. In a lot of ways, it's driven by the legislation that we're seeing being introduced in recent years, and I think we're going to talk about that shortly. But it's also created a culture of secrecy, which has led to frankly, I think a deeply troubling loss of transparency at all levels of government, right down to local government. The way that FOI is used, and again, Anne has spoken about that. And that's why I think we need an overall reform of all of our legislation.
Courtney, sitting here in Australia and looking at journalistic practice in the United States, I suppose the most obvious one is your dear leader, Donald Trump's berating of journalists on a daily basis. Has there been a shift in journalistic practice on a day-to-day, given that culture that the Trump administration has been fostering?
I think, yes, we've seen some shift. It's become now the norm, when you cover the president, especially if you're a woman or a minority journalist or a journalist from a news outlet that he doesn't like, to, expect attacks. We just released our own report about the Trump administration and the media, following on our Obama administration, the press report, and found that those attacks are having a really detrimental impact on the psychosocial element of journalists trying to do their jobs, but also, of course, on public perception. But I think that one thing that really stands out is the similarities between the United States and Australia, and frankly, the global trend that we've seen over the past 20 years. You mentioned this in the report, but the past 20 years is basically post 9/11, the whole war on terror, right? So this framework that was set up to combat terrorism, which is a laudable goal, was manipulated and expanded, and had inadequate restrictions on many of the powers it granted to governments. It was manipulated by governments around the world to justify the imprisonment of journalists. I mean, Peter being a perfect example of that in Egypt. And we're very worried looking at what's happening with coronavirus here in the United States, in Australia, and around the world, that this might become another excuse to give the government vast powers, or to tell, for the government to say, hey, we don't have to fulfill freedom of information requests. Our Department of Justice made a request to basically get rid of habeas corpus and not have to fulfill any freedom of information requests, to hold people indefinitely without charges, which we saw what happened with Guantanamo after 9/11. So we are very concerned, I think, about what the impact that the coronavirus and the response to the coronavirus is going to have around the world, especially with these surveillance regimes being rolled out. And again, let's learn the lessons from September 11th and the war on terror.
So following up from that, I mean, in Australia since 2001, as highlighted in our report, George Williams, the Dean of Law at UNSW, has pointed out that there have been 82 separate national security laws passed in Australia by what he calls a convenient bipartisanship. That's on average one every 3 months. And despite the win that News Corp and Annika Smethurst had in the High Court this year, that was really on a technicality. Disturbingly, the court found that there was no real freedom of expression. It wasn't going to refer to it because it didn't think that really existed in our constitution, which kind of does in the US Constitution. I'll come to Peter now. In terms of changing this framework that we operate in, you're saying that on the surface, look, you can get a newspaper, you can watch the news, we criticize the government, but what's really building underneath in terms of the legal framework, and what needs to change there?
It's exactly as Courtney pointed out. It's the way in which governments have used national security as a way of introducing all sorts of laws that have, in ways both small and large, limited our civil liberties. Now that's happened right across our human rights across Australia. But obviously we're talking about press freedom in particular here, and we're seeing, as you mentioned with George Williams' comment, that there's a kind of bipartisan approach to the legislation, which means that a lot of very damaging laws have made it onto the statutes, and made it impossible to protect our sources, for journalists to protect sources, for example. The data retention legislation that was passed a few years ago gives the government unfettered access without a warrant to any Australian's metadata, to a whole host of agents, not just the security services. Now, there is a regime in which the security services need a warrant to investigate journalists. That's the only exception to the rule, but that whole process operates so obscurely with zero transparency that it's almost impossible to guarantee the protection of journalist sources. We know that there's espionage and foreign interference laws, which make it extremely dangerous to communicate with Commonwealth civil servants. There's a whole raft of legislation which we need to change. Now, there are a couple of attempts, a couple of organisations that are pushing for legislative reform, that are asking for specific changes to laws, and I think that is laudable. But what we saw with the raids, with the AFP raids, and particularly the laws that the AFP used in the raid on the ABC, is the way in which laws that, such as the Crimes Act, which prohibits or criminalizes, makes a criminal offence to receive stolen property. That kind of law is not something that you would expect the lawmakers to build in an exception for journalists. We can't expect them to put an amendment that says it's okay for journalists to receive stolen property if it's in the public interest. That's just not going to fly. And so what we need is some kind of overarching law, a Media Freedom Act, which is something that my organisation, the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, is advocating for. A law that'll establish the principle of press freedom deep in our legal DNA in the way that the First Amendment does it in the United States. Because surprisingly, for a lot of Australians, we are one of the few, in fact, I believe we're the only democracy in the West that doesn't have press freedom written into our legal code anywhere at all.
Courtney, so we've got this situation where we have whistleblowers in jail in Australia. Richard Boyle, who, he blew the whistle on ATO's debt collection. He's facing a long time in jail. I'm just wondering, in terms of, from a global perspective, how what you know of the Australian press freedom regime, how it fits in with what's happening globally.
Yeah, I think we see, obviously the types of challenges that Australia is facing is going to differ a lot from countries that don't have democratic systems and rule of law. So let's compare it to other, democracies that have similar political systems. And I think we see a lot of the same pressures. We see national security being used as an excuse. Obviously, let's get it out there. There are legitimate national security interests, but we're often seeing that used as an excuse to abrogate broader rights, to undermine press freedom. We're seeing a lot of, technology related, frameworks, as you mentioned. The encryption law, I think there was a law in Australia against using encryption. The raids that we saw last year, the muzzling of the ability of journalists to report on a global story. I think it involved a priest committing a crime. These are really concerning to see in a liberal Western democracy that is typically, it's part of what they call the WEOG group in the United Nations, Western Europe and other group, kind of the groups that typically protect and support human rights. And I think that for quite a while, we've been concerned about what's happening in Australia because it lacks that fundamental foundation for press freedom. And so every law that's passed has a lot of potential implications for journalists. And I think, Peter laid those out much better than I can. I'm not an expert on this. But we definitely see that, when a terrorist attack happens or, a national security incident, that spurs additional action. So for example, the Christchurch attack in New Zealand gave rise to a lot of discussion around, how do we moderate content online? Another word for, censor particular types of content. So, I think we're worried about what direction Australia is heading because we'd like to see them leading. We'd like to see you guys playing a much more, robust leadership role, especially in the vacuum that has been left by the decline in US leadership on this issue. There really is no global champion for press freedom anymore, though, the UK and Canada are trying to take up that mantle, at least rhetorically, with their Media Freedom Coalition. But, we really don't see countries standing up in the way that we need them to for journalists behind bars around the world and to set an example domestically that will resonate around the world.
So the cases in Australia around national security, the raids, no one's contesting that these stories weren't in the public interest, yet they're being pursued. And both in the US and here, we really see an attempt to undermine trust in journalism. And I'd like to go to a question and maybe see if Anne can answer. It's from Astrid, who's a journalism student. I'm hoping Astrid is ready for her question about how journalists can respond to this erosion of trust.
Hi, Marcus. Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm a second-year journalism student at the University of Canberra. One of the most common comments I get when I tell people that I'm studying journalism is that saying, oh, so we can't believe anything you say then. How are we going to change this as journalists? How can we improve our image in Australia?
Well, I think one of the things we do, we already do this, but maybe we need to do it more, is to promote the really important stories that we break and sing our own praises loudly. We need to push back much more when governments turn around and say, you know, oh, that media company is no good or whatever. You know, that's part of the role of the union and part of the role of the Walkleys to really champion what we do and how it makes a difference, because it does. The second thing that someone else raised on the chat was having organisations like a Federal Corruption Commission, which can then, you know, journalists sometimes can start an investigation. They can't quite get to the bottom of it. And those sort of institutions are really important for holding politicians to account and bolstering what journalists do to expose wrongdoing.
Maybe I shift back to you, Peter, in terms of this undermining of trust. Is in terms of the framework that exists, how can that framework be used to help try and shift trust? Because I think sometimes non-journalists probably get a little bit tired of journalists telling each other how good they are.
Yeah. I know what you're saying. Look, I think there are a couple of points, and again, is right. But I think there's a trend, particularly in the US, where we're seeing journalists and news organisations being completely transparent, at least as transparent as they possibly can, about what lies behind the work, to make it quite clear the amount of time and effort that journalists have gone to verify facts, to confirm, to show people how the sausage is made, if you like. As I said, there are limits to how far you can go without exposing your sources, and we need to make sure that's maintained, that kind of protection is maintained. But I think that there is, you know, we also need to remind people that that even news that it doesn't conform to your beliefs is often usually perfectly valid, particularly if it comes from strong news sources, news organizations with credibility and authority, because the business runs on trust. And if you start publishing material that doesn't have integrity, then you'll pretty soon lose the confidence of your readers and audiences. And we know that social media is extremely good at calling BS when it sees it. So I think there is a need. There is also a need, though, and I'm going to say this, I think that there's a real need for the industry as well to really take the moral high ground with journalism. There's too many times I think we're seeing a race to the bottom, and that's largely because of the need to generate clicks in a lot of cases for stories to make sure that we keep incomes strong. That model tends to prioritize speed over accuracy, polemic over analysis, and I think we need to try and really fight hard to maintain that high ground, to make sure that we maintain the trust of the public, because ultimately, if we don't have the trust of the public, then it's going to be very, very difficult to push our legislators to give us the kind of laws that we need to keep press freedom alive.
Courtney, do you think there's been any shift in this lockdown period towards a appetite for like slow journalism, deeper journalism? Are people reading more deeply? And so is this shifting how journalism is both produced and consumed at the moment? Or do you think there's just this continual relentless pursuit of clicks?
Well, I think the advertising industry is decimated by coronavirus from what I've been reading, and that is having a ripple effect throughout the news industry, the broader media industry, you know, the tech platforms as well. So I have a feeling that the emphasis on clicks has diminished. I don't have any, you know, quantitative evidence of that, but it doesn't seem like that is the focus. Right now, journalists are focused on bringing people information, on making sure that the public is informed. That is their fundamental role. And just to go to something, you know, Peter said, you know, press freedom and give journalists the protections they need for press freedom. But press freedom is actually a right for everybody, because it's through journalists that people are informed. It's the journalists who are comparing the official numbers that, you know, governments are giving with what reports from hospitals, and cross-referencing with other forms of data, and going to experts, you know, at the WHO or other, you know, experts to cross-reference information, try to dig into, you know, what is the truth during a time when it's very unclear whether there is a truth, when the truth is still evolving with new information, when we have world leaders who are, you know, giving inaccurate and potentially dangerous information, and putting journalists in a very challenging position of having to report that and contextualize that. I think what I've heard here in the United States is that there is an increase in visits to mainstream media websites, mainstream news media. But I have also done some reporting around freelance journalists, and they are decimated. And, you know, the news industry increasingly relies on on freelancers as foreign correspondents to cover stories that, you know, aren't major beats. And meanwhile, the consolidation in the business means that, you know, one journalist is often covering many beats. And now there's this, you know, relatively narrow focus on coronavirus. What are all the other stories that aren't getting told? So I think it's really hard to say. I think that this experience now that we're going through is going to fundamentally reconfigure the industry, the news industry.
Thanks, Scott. I'll just go to a question now from Peter, and maybe Peter can respond in terms of what this means for legal frameworks about what is a journalist. We talk about active journalism can be committed by any member of society. There's no real, what defines what we do differently to what a blogger does. So I'll go to Peter now.
Sorry, a bit slow on the mute button. Yes, I think this is a really good problem. It's a problem that keeps coming up. In fact, the issue of defining who it is and what it is that you're trying to protect really cuts to the very core of these kinds of debates. And it's actually something that I'm starting to do some research on at the University of Queensland. My own instinct at this point, though, is to suggest that we ought to be looking, as you've said, at protecting acts of journalism rather than the journalists, or trying to carve out a particular individual. Hang on, sorry about this. Rather than trying to look after the industry. Could you try? Sorry about that. Rather than too much electronic gadgetry here. Rather than trying to define who it is that we need to be protected. I mean, the Prime Minister said, sorry, I'm just going to shut this off altogether. Rather than trying to protect a particular class of individuals, set them above the law, as the Prime Minister said last year, we need to recognise that what matters isn't the who, and I think Courtney pointed this out, that this isn't about journalists themselves, this is about the service that journalists provide to the public and to our democracy. And it's that function that we need to be protecting. Now, at the moment, anybody that has an internet connection and a keyboard can publish stuff online and call themselves a journalist. And it feels to me as though it's a pointless exercise to try and ring fence who that ought to be. What we need to be protecting in law is public interest journalism. And I think you can set legally defined standards that say that as long as the work is clearly in the public interest, as long as the journalist has taken necessary steps to confirm the facts in the story, that the story adheres to professional and ethical standards, and as long as it doesn't unduly violate the privacy of certain individuals or very clearly defined national security information, then that work must count as legitimate and has to be protected. I think that's possible. Now, we need to do more work to decide exactly how you draw those lines. But I think that's an approach that is actually functional and possible.
Thanks, Peter. I'll shift over to Courtney now, maybe with the focus on the international. I mean, one of the frustrations I think I've had involving in the Right to Know campaign, it was a fantastic campaign to launch for us to try and get law reform in Australia around press freedom, but we're having trouble cutting through to the general public, that it seems like journalists talking to journalists rather than this is a right for all the citizenry. It's not just a right for media organisations to publish. So in terms of, this is happening amid a war on journalism, really, launched possibly softly after 9/11, but really I think Trump and even Boris Johnson has really been pursuing relentlessly, and we're seeing in Brazil, Bolsonaro also pursuing journalists, and generally a step up in the murder of journalists and impunity. What's going on globally, Courtney, with this war on journalism and how it's affecting everyone's rights, not just journalists?
Absolutely. So what we're seeing is the ongoing war of journalism by repressive authoritarian states. We saw that really ramp up after the Arab Spring, as many countries that thought, oh, the internet is something over there, realized that actually they could harness these digital technologies for repression and surveillance. So that's been ongoing. I think what we've seen that's new in the past few years is the rise of authoritarian inclined populist leaders. So you mentioned Bolsonaro in Brazil, there's Duterte in the Philippines, there's Orban in Hungary, and there's Trump in the United States. There's they're all over the world. So we're really seeing this increase of world leaders who denigrate the concept of journalism, who tar journalists and media outlets as fake news, a rhetoric. It started as rhetoric, but we've really seen it turn into actual violence against journalists as it creates a permissive environment to lambaste and attack journalists, but also a significant increase in the number of journalists who are imprisoned on false news or fake news charges. So we're seeing that around the world it's become a very challenging place to do journalism. You've got the, ongoing economic decimation of the model that much of journalism is based on, and struggling to figure out how in the digital era to become sustainable. You couple that with, the new economic crisis brought on by the coronavirus, couple that with getting squeezed by, the politicians on the one side and the public on the other, which doesn't seem to understand in many cases what the role of journalism is, how journalism is done. There was a survey that a partner organization did here in the US that showed some people did not understand that anonymous source does not mean anonymous to the journalist. So there's a real lack of understanding. And I think that many people don't necessarily connect something that they value, for example, finding out about a sexual assaults against USA gymnasts, this huge ongoing case was revealed because a journalist decided to dig into it. And there are countless examples like that. And so I think, going back to an earlier question, also linking that, what journalists are doing in the daily lives of people and how that links to them. But as we see the decline in local journalism, it's getting harder and harder to make that link to, an individual's lived experience and this thing called journalism that, someone that maybe they've never met a journalist anymore. It's not, sadly, a field that many people maybe want to go into if they're the poor student who spoke earlier, if that's the feeling. I hope we're going to see a change after coronavirus because of the importance that reliable information is playing.
Thanks, Scott. I'll go to a question from Marcus May, which was probably better answered by Anne and Peter. But Courtney, there's a hyper partisanship in journalism and some of the publishing and broadcasting organisations across the world. I suppose Fox News is the poster child of that. How is that affecting press freedom and perception of what the press does? And then I'll come to Marcus May.
Well, it's interesting because I think in some countries, the press has always been somewhat partisan, and you have examples like France where, the journalism is already identified in some way with being affiliated, news outlets affiliated with political parties, but then you see that in places like Lebanon, and that's a disaster. So it really, partisanship, I think it's when it gets incorporated into the idea of what facts are facts, what counts as truth, the idea that I think also that all news is the same is challenging. We have a lot of punditry in the United States, which, gets the label of news, but I think it's really important to talk about things in a precise manner. So we can talk about journalism, and that is different than punditry. But to go to Peter's point, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't get protected, that you shouldn't, not be attacked or arrested or threatened or have your sources revealed, right? But we should be able to distinguish between, I think, reliable, factual, at least fact-seeking, accurate information versus punditry and opinion.
So it's people who know, yes, Minister and yes, Prime Minister will remember that great scene where they go through what every newspaper in Britain does. The Guardian is read by people who think they should run the, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, so that fragmentation has existed, but it's now in a culture of the internet, which allows for much deeper, wider fragmentation, plus a collapsing of the business model. So I'll come to Marcus's question now, if he's there. No, Marcus May?
Yes.
You had a question about really hyper-partisanship and misinformation in that context.
Yeah. It seems to me that the spread of misinformation by the Murdoch machine, Sky News here in Australia, has been devastating to journalists' credibility. And in all the media trust surveys, credibility is going through the floor. What can we do? What can journalists do? What can the nation do to call out this misinformation when it occurs?
Thanks, Mark.
Okay, well,
Anne, have a crack.
I'll have a crack. I don't actually see anything wrong with having partisan outlets. I think that's part of freedom of the press. You should be able to have a particular slant. You just have to let people know where you're coming from. So, for instance, on The Guardian, we make no secret that we're a progressive, we come from a progressive stance, and we cover certain issues that are important to, we would say, to the world, but also to our readers, like the environment, like climate change, like social issues. Fox would probably argue that they cover issues that are important to their audience, like national security, and I'm sure the Australian would say they're definitely catering to their audience. Where I think the problem is where we've got commentary that doesn't distinguish itself from news, and we've certainly got that going on some of the Murdoch press, where you sometimes pick up the front page and you think, what am I reading? Is it a news story? Is it someone's view about what's happening in New South Wales politics? So I think we want to we need to call out when someone crosses the line into commentary and it's not based on facts. And that's probably something that the profession needs to do. But to try and stop opinion from a particular viewpoint, I actually have a bit of a problem with that. And, so I'm pretty tolerant of the Sky After Dark people, as long as they stick to the facts and they make it quite clear that they're commentators, not news readers.
So, Peter, this fragmentation of news sources with a political slant, this can be weaponized by governments. And I think the way that you and your colleagues in Egypt were treated may be an example of that. I don't know if you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I see what happened to us in Egypt as a pretty egregious example of the kinds of things that we're seeing happening all over the world. And this is, Courtney referred to this earlier on, where national security is being used as an excuse to silence inconvenient journalism. What happened to us was that we're in a situation where we're reporting on what was unfolding in Egypt, an ongoing political crisis, and journalists are responsible for speaking to everyone involved in a particular dispute, everyone involved in the crisis. And we were doing our jobs. One of the biggest parties was the Muslim Brotherhood. They'd previously formed the first democratically elected government in Egypt's history before they were ousted 6 months earlier. And so we felt that they had a very important voice that we had to speak to. It just so happens, excuse me, that the government started accusing them of being involved in acts of terrorism, and so by reporting on them, we apparently violated laws prohibiting the promoting terrorist ideology. Now, the fact is that what's been happening to us in Australia is the same kind of thing, not to the same extent, but we now have national security legislation, which has made it very difficult, made it a criminal offence for a lot of journalists to do their jobs. And in fact, we also happen to have a law that criminalises advocating terrorist ideology, and that makes it very dangerous, for example, to go and investigate what it is that drives Islamic extremists, perhaps, for example, to go off and join the fight. Now, whatever you think of the ideology, the fact is that I think we have a responsibility to interrogate and understand what's going on, and that's what good journalism is all about. And so I think that what happened to us was an example of the way in which, I'm not suggesting that Australia is about to become Egypt, but we are vulnerable to the same kinds of political and social pressures that Egypt was at the time.
Thanks, Peter. So I was at the IFJ Congress in Tunisia last year, where we launched a global campaign to try and bring in a UN convention on the protection of journalists because of the number of journalists who have been killed in the last 20, 30 years, and they've been killed with impunity. Hardly any of them have ever even been arrested, let alone taken to trial and imprisoned. There's a question from Clare Arthurs. We can bring in really for Courtney about this. Hello, is Clare Arthurs there?
I think she needs to unmute.
Yeah, unmute.
I've asked a couple of questions. Which particular one would you like me to talk to?
This is regarding the 2,000 journalists being killed. If you just want to maybe ask Courtney about this.
Yeah, I was responding to a comment that somebody made about the chilling effect of the attacks on journalists. And when you look at the numbers of us that are being killed, and then you multiply that by X number who are being threatened and coerced, is there any surprise that some stories are not being covered?
So I think that what we see from the figures of journalists being killed is that there was a real rise over the past years when, the Iraq War, the Syria War, etc. Last year, we saw a really interesting and we hope permanent drop. We're not really sure what it means, but what I hope it means is that no, stories aren't going to be off limits, but journalists are not going to stay silent if their colleagues are killed. And there are a bunch of different initiatives that have emerged. So first, there were two really horrible murders in Europe, in EU member countries. Daphne Caruana Galizia, a Maltese blogger, investigative journalist who was killed by a car bomb right outside of her home, and then Jock Cheetham, an investigative journalist in Slovakia, both who were murdered. Well, one of the things that happened with these extremely egregious murders was the journalistic community came together to continue their reporting on the issues that they were covering when they were murdered. So, we see initiatives like Forbidden Stories, which continues, again, like there was a story in Ecuador that a journalist and a photojournalist were killed on the border of Colombia reporting on. So they've continued the story. So there are really innovative solidarity measures like that. We've also seen a newfound, I would say, since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, which it really stands out as one of the most brazen murders of a journalist and, utter lack of follow-up from the country where he resided, my own, you know, that I think shifted the dynamics in the media industry. And we've seen a willingness by the Washington Post, which created a press freedom partnership, the One Free Press campaign, which was kind of started by Forbes and has, you know, dozens and scores of global media partners that every month are publishing a list of the top 10 urgent cases of journalists under threat that we're helping them curate. So, you know, it's shifted. Personally, I don't know that we need more conventions or, you know, statements by the UN. I think that it's, you know, we work very closely with IFJ, the International Federation of Journalists. You know, we are very supportive. We certainly work at the UN, but there are many resolutions on the safety of journalists. There is a UN action plan on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. But yet we don't see any real meaningful action being taken. The Secretary General appointed a special advisor, you know, in his office on these issues. And, you know, we could be waiting forever, I think, for the UN to make a substantial difference on the ground. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't work through the UN. I will be participating in about 9 hours in a UNESCO conference on press freedom and these issues. But the fact is, if we're going to protect journalists in a meaningful way and change that horrible statistic, it's going to take us as journalists and press freedom advocates standing up for them, continuing their work, and making sure that the laws, the defamation laws that criminalize it, that people are brought to justice. We have actually seen the impunity rate decline from 9 out of 10 to 8 out of 10, so that's good. But, you know, we need to do more, and we have to raise the alarm, I think, you know, really raise our voices when journalists are killed, and that has improved over the past few years.
Thank you. That's the beginnings of a bit of optimism and struggle and fight back, which I like to hear, because it's very easy to get quite despondent about the state of press freedom. But I always think humans have always told stories, and we've always sought the truth. I think it's something in our social fabric that we want to find out. I'd like to just go to Jock Cheetham, if he's there. He's made an interesting comment about it's not just media that's fragmenting, but it's the public sphere perhaps that's fragmenting. And do you want to turn that into a question? And Jock?
Yeah, sure. Because I wonder if the decline in trust in all institutions, public institutions, government and media, is to do with the fact that maybe over the past 50 years, there seems to be a decline in the idea of serving the public interest or the national interest. And it just seems to be so common that people serve their parties or their corporations or things like this. And I think there's a real diminution of the public sphere. But, you know, is this an important issue? Is this a part of what's happening? Is it a cultural phenomena? And in that sense, are we all to blame, as, you know, because it's not just the politicians and the media, it's the people too. You know, are we becoming more selfish?
Well, from optimism back to pessimism, perhaps. Peter or Anne, do you want to, or Courtney, do you want to jump in?
I'll have a go at that one. Interestingly, in Australia, we've seen governments get on a lot better during the COVID-19 crisis. I think obviously opposition still need to ask questions and test out whether we're following the best policy, but there has been a sort of refreshing coming together for a common purpose of tackling the problem. And I'm sort of hoping some of that will endure beyond the crisis. And, you know, I do think Jock's right that if you're always criticising and picking away and never acknowledging the good side of what anyone does in an institution, then it really does undermine trust in the end. And so I can see a slight ray of hope out of this bad period that might lead to some greater understanding and cooperation.
I will offer a different perspective, because sadly we do not have a coming together in this country. And I think in many parts of the world, we're seeing also, you know, the split between kind of the official press and the independent press. You know, many journalists who are getting retaliated against for reporting unofficial statistics around coronavirus, et cetera. I'm glad to hear that there's some hope in Australia, because I don't think that we're going to, I think that we are seeing that people are realizing more the importance of journalism, but we have to remember that a lot of people are getting their journalism on technology platforms that actually favor extremism, encourage partisanship. If you think about, for example, a Friends of Friends structure, this is what Maria Ressa, a journalist under threat in the Philippines who runs Rappler, she talks about, you know, how the way that you get friends of friends encourages further movement away from each other. The tech platforms that we're on are trying to get us to spend as much time as we can on there. And they, you know, the underlying assumption is that you should get more news that you like, that will keep you engaged, right? But I think that journalists have always, you know, had an issue with trust from the public. You know, this idea that there was some halcyon day when everyone trusted the media, I don't know that that's true. You know, they're the traditionally disenfranchised. You opened up with an acknowledgement of the native peoples of a land. I don't think they saw themselves reflected in the media very often in the past. Women for many years, you know, did not see that. So, you know, I think we have to be careful about blaming the lack of trust in the media too much. Certainly there were huge failures, again, like Iraq War being chief among them, where the media has failed, but you know, it's a much broader institutional decline, right? Just in terms of the robustness of institutions globally, whether we're talking about UN institutions, whether we're talking about, you know, domestic institutions in many of these countries where literally, you know, democratic frameworks are being dismantled. And I don't think it's surprising, therefore, that you see, you know, low levels of trust in the media.
Peter, have you got a reflection on that? And
yeah,
I'm conscious of time as well.
I'll make this fairly brief. I think one of the biggest problems has been the loss of any kind of sense of what counts as public debate. We've become so fragmented with the debates, and it's, you know, it's a bit of an old trope now to complain about the digital silos that we increasingly find ourselves in. But I think the fragmentation of the media is also going along with the fragmentation of the social spaces that Courtney mentioned, and she mentioned, she quoted the extraordinary Ressa there. And I think that's a big part of it. It's not just our fault. It's a systemic problem, and I'm not entirely sure how we get that back in the box. I think Anne is partly right, but this COVID-19 crisis and the bushfires before that has helped us understand the importance of good authoritative media and independent media. It's driven an awful lot of people back to those trusted sources, the familiar sources, the mainstream sources. But I don't think that it's shown us the need for it and the value of having a common conversation. The problem is that I don't think that structurally the digital communications are facilitating it in the way that we need to have a functioning democracy.
So it seems that a lot of the digital platforms is shifting a hyper speed in terms of our consumption of media. I mean, the sports rorts, which were just a few months ago, has all but disappeared from Australian political conversation, but they still exist. But there is some movement in Australia through this to try and get the media, those platforms, to contribute back to the cost of media. And I'll go to Sarah Jacob now, if she's there. She's got a question about this.
Yes, thank you, Marcus. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I mean, there's been a recent announcement from the government that they're going to try and make the major social media platforms pay for news content. I was wondering if this might help change the game in Australia in terms of the ability of the media to try and put forward their news. I've also heard some commentary that it will probably only benefit the big players like Nine and Murdoch Press. I was just wondering what the the panelists thought of that.
Good question, Anne or Peter, and then maybe get a global view of it as well.
Okay, well, I think it probably will benefit the big media companies more than small ones. I think it's really important that we shore up the revenue streams of those organisations, and that if the platforms are taking news, they should be paying a contribution towards it. They've always said we're just carriers, but in fact, they've behaved as publishers and they curate news. And on the issue of people getting in their own little bubble on news, I think probably the answer is to educate young people about how these platforms work and get them to understand that what they see online is not necessarily a reflection of what's going on in their entire world. Just one other point, in this crisis we've seen a whole lot of closures or stopping printing of regional papers and local papers. It really, really is important that they keep going. Whether they'll survive beyond this is another matter, and it's something government should think very carefully about funding, because a country town without a newspaper will miss a whole lot of very, very important things going on.
Thanks, Anne. We also, I think, need to educate older users, because I think there was a study that showed that the cohort that distributes most fake news on Facebook are boomers.
Point taken.
I think young people have a pretty savvy idea of a lot of social media platforms. Is there any, I think we're about to wrap up. So on that, Courtney, I mean, in Spain and France, Google and Facebook just said, get stuffed, and they wouldn't allow themselves to be dragged into a mandatory payment system. What hope have we got?
I think we're seeing some very interesting experimentation play out. It's interesting because the baseline is taken, it seems to me, that there should be no regulation, there should be no taxation, that things should be how they were because that's how they developed. But, we have choices to make as consumers. Our legislators have choices to make. And to talk about, at least in the US, we have this very anti-regulatory viewpoint. In the EU, they're much more open to regulation. So I think we're going to see some really interesting things play out. We don't have a position really one way or the other on that. I think that our key goal at the Committee to Protect Journalists is to make sure that there is press freedom on the platforms, that we recognize that in many repressive countries, the only way to get out independent news is on these platforms. And let's bring it full circle back to China and coronavirus. And how did we find out what was happening there? Because we had some very courageous scientists, journalists, and citizen journalists, several of whom are still missing or in detention, who brought us that news, who reported on what they were seeing on the ground. So and they did that on YouTube. Chen Shishi, for example, they were doing that on social media platforms. We can go back to the Arab Spring, same sort of thing. So whatever approaches are taken, one of the goals should be to make sure that those platforms are still available for those really important, independent, oppressed voices in some of the most closed countries of the world.
Thanks. Peter, you've got a minute for a final comment?
Yeah, just two very quick things. One is that I think there's a tendency to see press freedom and national security in contest with one another. I think one of the things we need to remind ourselves is that they're part of the same system. If you're trying to protect us as Australians, and surely it has to be also about protecting the system of democracy that's made us one of the safest and most peaceful and prosperous places on earth in the first place. And a free, vigorous press is intimately bound up with that. So if you pass national security legislation that damages press freedom, then you're national security. The other thing is, I think this is really key, is that Australia needs also to take a leading role. Courtney touched on this earlier, that we're seeing press freedom being degraded across the region. In fact, last night in the Philippines, we saw the largest, most popular television news service, CBS, closed down around the coronavirus issues. And this is a massive blow on democracy. Australia needs to speak up to condemn this, because if we are not able to take the lead, across the region, then we're going to see democracy backsliding everywhere. We need to be about this.
Thanks, Peter. I couldn't agree more. I think we can oppose national security and press freedom. A secure society is a free society, and I think that press freedom has to be the bedrock of it. Thanks for everyone who has spoken today, and thanks for everybody to turn up. I just want to thank the sponsors of Australia at Home, which is Essential Media, Principal Company, Guardian Australia, the Centre for Australian Progress, and the Community Council for Australia. Tomorrow, you can join Malcolm Turnbull and Christine Jackman. I imagine Malcolm will be wearing his leather jacket tomorrow because he wants to talk about his relationship with the progressive movement. So you can all ask him about his role as communications minister and how he got helped get an SBS journalist sacked. So thanks everyone, and if you're a journalist and you're not a union member, do join. Thanks everyone.